Now, in this video, I want to talk about NATO and specifically, like, what is the history of Ukraine being invited, but not quite invited, but maybe invited, but no, we're not going to have them into NATO. What's going on here? So we'll start with this. February 13th, 2025, Trump was saying the war started because Biden said that Ukraine could join NATO. I don't see any way a country in Russia's position could allow them to join. Okay, Biden wasn't trying to invite them into NATO, and then that caused the war. Biden was actually the one saying, no, you cannot join NATO throughout the course of the last 3 years. Now, Trump is wrong. Biden actually opposed Ukrainian NATO membership. Let's hear what Trump had to say, and then I'll explain what actually happened, what transpired up through where we are today.
Pretty accurate. I don't see any way that a country in Russia's position could allow them, just in their position, could allow them to join NATO. I don't see that happening. And long before President Putin, Russia was very strong on the fact that I believe that's the reason the war started, because Biden went out and said that they could join NATO, and he shouldn't have said that. As soon as he said that, I said, you know what? You're going to have a war now, and I was right about that. This is a war that would have never happened if I were president.
But you don't think it's President Biden's fault, not President Putin? I mean, he's the one.
I think Biden is incompetent, and I think when he said that they could join NATO, I thought that was a very stupid thing to say. I thought when he said, well, it depends if it's a minor incursion. In other words, it's okay if Russia does a minor incursion. I thought that was a very foolish thing to say.
Okay, let's correct the record. We'll start with the minor incursion. Yeah, he did send mixed signals there, but then beyond that, everything is wrong. So that Biden said you can join NATO and that's what caused Putin to do this? No, that wasn't it at all. Let's go back to the very beginning. And by the way, he always blames Biden for everything. Like, Biden is incompetent. He doesn't understand what he's doing. And if he wasn't there and I was there, this never would have happened. Well, you can't really prove that one way or another, but let's go back and look at the history here. So let's go back to 2002. Putin stated that he had no objections to Ukraine joining NATO. He went on to say that Ukraine is a sovereign nation with the right to choose its own security alliances. So here he is. Let's just hear what he has to say, and I'm going to read because, well, it's in Russian. So Ukraine has declared its readiness to join NATO. Please tell me how negotiations, or rather its possible negotiations on Ukraine's accession to NATO, can affect the development of relations between Russia. And so Putin is going to think about this. Russia and Ukraine are developing their bilateral relations in a special manner. Now, they've always talked about it as a special relationship. These are close states which originated from the same family of the Soviet republics. And in recent years, relations between Russia and Ukraine have been developing especially positively, he says in 2002. As for NATO expansion in general, you know, our attitude to this issue, it doesn't change. But this does not mean that Ukraine should stay away from the process that benefit the strengthening of peace and security in Europe. So this was Putin talking in 2002. So something significantly happened. And on the planet Earth as a whole, we didn't discuss this topic in detail with our colleagues. Ukraine is a sovereign state. Ukraine's a sovereign state, and it has the right to choose the way to ensure its own security. But let's say participation in the advice we created today, this should be discussed with the members of the Council and with the members of the North Atlantic Bloc, with the Secretary General. Okay, so again, he's saying Ukraine's a sovereign state back in 2002. I think this is quite possible, and in principle, I don't see anything special here or anything that could darken or spoil relations between Russia and Ukraine. Okay, we're going to stop there. Okay, so that was what Putin was saying in 2002. Fast forward a little bit. Now, here I pulled out the New York Times. This is NATO allies oppose Bush on Georgia and Ukraine. I had to go back into the library databases to actually find this because I just couldn't find it online. President Bush, through the NATO summit meeting here off script on Wednesday, lobbying hard to extend membership to Ukraine and Georgia, but he failed to rally support for the move among key allies. Now, this is 2008, after I'm going to show you what Putin was saying in a video here in just a little bit, but it was Bush that was pushing for this, not Biden. Okay, Mr. Bush's position, by the way, if you don't know, if you're outside the United States, Bush was a Republican, Biden is a Democrat. Mr. Bush's position that Ukraine and Georgia should be welcomed into a Membership Action Plan, or MAP, that prepares nations for NATO membership, directly contradicted German and French government positions stated earlier this week. Mr. Bush failed to win over a consensus of NATO members in a debate at dinner of NATO leaders, a senior German official said Wednesday night, with at least 7 countries lined up against him. No final decisions have been made at the dinner, and that all parties agreed on the importance of keeping the North Atlantic Treaty Organization's door open to Ukraine. So, yes, we're going to invite you. We're not inviting you now. It's going to happen in time. So, like, Putin's seeing red here at this point, and I'll show you why. He's already said other things by this point that we're getting to. Mr. Bush, entering his last NATO summit meeting as president, was described by the official as wanting to lay down a marker for his legacy and not wanting to lose faith with the Ukrainian and Georgian peoples and the other former Soviet republics. He expressed his views candidly despite warnings from allies that he was complicating efforts to find diplomatic solutions. Normally, summit meetings like this are pre-scripted, but Mr. Bush's comments added some extra interest while annoying Germany and France, which said that they would block the invitation to Ukraine and Georgia. At the dinner on Wednesday, the German and French position was supported by Italy, Hungary, and the Benelux countries. Sorry, I mispronounced that. Officials were asked to find some construction overnight that would encourage Ukraine and Georgia without asking them to enter a membership plan now. Okay, so that's what happened. Now, this was in April 3rd of 2008. That's a date that we're looking at here. Now, let's look at some other things. Now, I asked another professor, he's a German, and you're going to see an interview with him on Thursday, I think, where we're talking about the German elections. But I asked him about this, and he said that, well, so I asked him about this particular, let's just hear what he has to say as I asked him about this article.
So, what do you make of this idea that Merkel begged not to resist? Lithuanian General Zeuks reveals the behind-the-scenes annexation of Crimea.
Yeah.
Can you shed any light on that for me?
Merkel is East German. Every East German is innately afraid of Russia. There's this perception that Russia is this immense power that you dare not antagonize. And I think that's fear. This is our occupying power, and here's the German arrogant part of this. Russia was the only one that really was able to defeat Germany. In the East, that's the perception. In the West, people know also about Normandy and stuff like that. In the East, I was taught it was the Soviet Union, mostly. Germany, as the greatest and most advanced and most powerful country in the world, was toppled by the Russians. This is like one predator that thinks they're so strong, and then there's the super predator. This explains the fear. This explains the submission to Putin in the East. This explains why the AfD can mine these feelings in the East, because the fear is Russian bombs on Berlin yet again. And to grow up in a country under that occupation, but also with Berlin for the first time, that was in the early aughts, there were still bullet holes in buildings. And the presence of this war is so large that it's fear. Populism thrives on fear, and that's how the AfD then minds it. But with Merkel, I think that was it. And the other thing was, there's a misperception in Germany that Willy Brandt, who created this Eastern politics, the Ostpolitik, was able to contribute to the fall of communism by trade, change through trade, Wandel durch Annäherung, change through approachment. What's missing in this is Reagan and the armament. Communism failed not just because of trade, but also because of a strength position on the other side. And the Russians or the Soviets were good till the 70s, where they were stronger than the Americans, but then the Americans upped the armament. And then the Americans undercut the Russians in Afghanistan. And the defeat in Afghanistan plus Chernobyl demonstrated Russian weakness or Soviet weakness. Yeah, but there's this German idea, has been for a while, that if you only trade with Russia, you can integrate them in the West.
Mhm.
But that works if you have a normal politician and not a bratva like KGB thug like Putin.
Okay, so help me with one more thing. So it was a Munich conference, I think, where Putin was talking like it's off. Before this, Bush is floating the idea that Ukraine can be and Georgia can become part of NATO. If I understand, if I have my facts correct, it was basically France and Germany that were involved in saying, no, 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 we really don't want to go down that path. Is that correct?
That is correct, again, because of fear of antagonizing Russia. And this is why the whole NATO caused the war argument is wrong. The EU caused the war.
That's right. Yeah.
It was when Ukraine said we want to be in the EU, and that's why they throw out Yanukovych. That's when Putin came, because the EU path means Ukrainians, who are very similar to Russians, can have democracy, but Russians, who are very similar to Ukrainians, can't.
And that contrast, man, that contrast is going to be glaring. It's like, look at Poland, how their economy has lifted off
Yeah.
since the split.
And so that has to be the strategy now, even if the peace treaty will be imperfect.
Okay, so that was then, but then something shifted. Like beforehand, Putin was kind of for Ukraine being potentially in NATO, and he was okay with it. But then when we get to 2004 and the Orange Revolution, and we're thinking, wait a minute, Ukraine is going to be way Western looking and not really tied to Russia's sphere of influence, and something changed. And I think part of what changed is that the color revolutions terrified Putin and made him think, oh, this could happen to me. And so something really changed in his psyche. Okay, this is 2006. Russia tells Ukraine to stay out of NATO. Russia yesterday, so 2 years earlier, before the Bush thing that I was just reading about, Russia yesterday warned Ukraine that, and two years before what I was reading about Bush, and 2 years after the color revolution, the Orange Revolution, Russia yesterday warned Ukraine the two countries' relations would be significantly damaged if Ukraine joined NATO, as protests against planned exercises in the Crimea kept hundreds of U.S. troops confined to barracks. Like, think about that. The Ukrainians were actually protesting U.S. troops, requiring them to stay in the barracks, like, to be safe. The statements came as 200 U.S. troops, who are in the predominantly Russian-speaking southern Ukrainian region of Crimea, prepare for NATO exercises due to start next Wednesday, remain trapped in their barracks. Protesters greeted their arrival last week with barricades and slogans reading, "Occupiers, go home." That's what they were saying to Americans back in 2006, and reportedly harassed them if they step outside the military base. The Marine reservists are in the region to prepare for Sea Bronze 2006 NATO maneuvers on the Black Sea, intended as a key sign of the West's slow embrace of Ukraine. On Tuesday, the Crimean Parliament declared the region a NATO-free zone. The Crimean Parliament declared the region a NATO-free zone, a move, it was said, intended to support the anti-NATO protesters. Ukraine's NATO ambitions are long-standing and were entertained by President Viktor Yushchenko's predecessor, unseated in the so-called Orange Revolution in November 2004. But the pro-Western protests that ushered in Mr. Yushchenko into power have heightened Kremlin sensitivities about losing influence over former Soviet satellites. So that's where we were in 2006. And then you get to 2007. But before we get there, let's look at the benefits of Ukrainian membership in NATO. In July of 2007 is when this article by the Marshall Center was written. At the moment, the issue of NATO membership, you're not going to be able to see the full thing just because of the size of my screen, and I apologize for that. At the moment, the issue of Ukrainian membership in NATO is on hold for a number of reasons, including radically divergent opinions within the government between the president and the prime minister, or the desirability of Ukraine seeking NATO integration, among many other issues. lack of support in Ukraine, and a need for considerable further reform. The continuing complexity, fractiousness, and uncertainty of the Ukrainian political process, and disagreement over foreign policy prerogatives, differing views among allies, and Ukrainian membership in NATO, and Russian pressure. Russian pressure was one of those key variables, number 6 here, right? Okay, so the state of play. NATO-Ukraine relations were formally launched in 1991 when Ukraine became a founding member of the North Atlantic Cooperation Council, later transformed into the Euro-Atlantic Partnership Council, and that later became the Partnership for Peace. Okay, the situation changed dramatically with the Orange Revolution following the 2004 elections. Ukraine's importance to NATO was reflected in the Secretary General's attendance at President Yushchenko's inauguration on 23 January 2005 and President Yushchenko's visit to separate meeting with allied heads of state and government during NATO 22 February 2005. Okay, so like we knew we were kind of moving that direction. But again, it was the Orange Revolution that changed everything, I think, in Putin's mind. Admission of Ukraine to Membership Action Plan status now seems a necessary step to membership, was being considered positively in the run-up to NATO's Riga summit in November of 2006. Okay, so what are the benefits of Ukraine in NATO? Well, a key benefit is that as an ally, Ukraine would enjoy the collective defense guarantees provided by Article 5 of the Washington Treaty. That is, all other allies would be committed to responding to an attack on Ukraine as an attack on them. Huh, about that. And yet it was blocked, and that's where we are. Directly related to collective defense are greatly diminished costs of assuring national defense for NATO allies compared to what they would have to spend on defense without NATO. Now, remember, this was written in 2006. The costs include an ally's contribution to common and joint funding, achieving the agreed target of defense expenditures of 2% of GDP. And in 2006, this was written. And even in 2025, there are a number of countries who still aren't doing that. But the situation gets even worse. Now, so then we go to 2007 and we go to Munich in 2007 and Putin's there and he starts berating the Americans. Now, he's talking about a number of things like we just can't trust them for this and that. And I'm going to play it without the sound and just look at Putin's body language as he's talking. And then you'll see the camera shift and look at the American delegation. And then you're going to see Senator McCain and Lieberman and the Secretary of Defense there, right here. And McCain's not happy with it. Lieberman's staring back. The Secretary of Defense is just thinking, this guy, really? Okay, so that was 2007. This is Putin's response to the idea here. So it's getting more antagonistic. Now that brings us back to where we were with that earlier article. And right now, Bush to press for Ukraine and Georgia and NATO. And just one little line here, France and Germany have resisted granting a map on the grounds that both states have yet to achieve political stability and that the process would unnecessarily antagonize Russia. That's right. That's Merkel talking right there. And Merkel, she defends this. Here's Merkel defends ties with Russia in blocking NATO. And just a little bit about this, former German Chancellor Angela Merkel told the BBC that the gas deals that she made with Russia were meant to help German firms and keep the peace with Moscow. She also insisted that the war in Ukraine would have started earlier had she not blocked Kyiv's entry into NATO in 2008. Or maybe they could have actually done it and had Ukraine in NATO before Russia could do what it's doing to Ukraine right now. And so now we see memes like this. We need air support, Ukrainians say, and the United Nations says, you're doing great. Right. But now you know the history. It wasn't Biden. Biden had nothing to do with it. If anything, Biden was blocking it, preventing it from going forward in the last year or so of his presidency. All right, my friends, I hope that helps you understand what has happened with NATO and Ukraine over the entire span of the discussions. Put your comments below. I'm curious to see what you say. Thank you for your time and your interest and the likes and the shares and the subscribes. And thank you for being the kind of person that cares about Ukraine.